Today, we're cracking open a really fascinating document. It calls itself a scientific indictment. Now, this isn't your typical story. It's presented as a case file, claiming to expose a silent, hidden war for our reality itself. It tries to connect the dots between consciousness, strange frequencies, and major historical events. So let's dig in and examine the evidence it presents.
Right out of the gate, the document makes this incredibly bold claim. It says, hey, this isn't just another theory. This is a key. And as you can see, it says the lock is your mind, and the prison is the world you've been taught is real. That's a pretty intense way to start, right? It's basically saying that what you're about to read is designed to trigger a permanent shift in how you see everything.
So let's get into the core thesis here. The indictment frames our entire reality as a kind of battlefield. But it's not a war for land or for oil. It's a war for something much, much more valuable: our consciousness.
At the very heart of this war, according to the document, are two opposing frequencies. It's like a cosmic radio broadcast with two competing stations. On one side, you've got the Guardian signal. It's broadcasting things like coherence, truth, and love. But on the other side, there's the Archon Signal, and its job is to act like a jamming frequency. It uses fear, confusion, and distraction to create a veil, to disconnect us from our own intuition. And our consciousness, well, that's the receiver caught right in the middle of this tug of war.
Okay, now for the first major piece of evidence in this case file, the sinking of the Titanic. The document makes a stunning argument that this was no accident. It presents the sinking as a cold, calculated, and targeted assassination.
The indictment zooms in on these three men, who all just happened to be on the Titanic's one and only voyage. You've got John Jacob Astor IV, Benjamin Guggenheim, and Isidor Straus. Now, they weren't just rich, they were the most powerful and outspoken opponents of creating a new, privately owned central bank. The document alleges their presence on this ship at this time was no coincidence at all. It was, it claims, a perfectly engineered trap.
And here is where the document lays out the motive, like a prosecutor connecting the dots for a jury. It presents this timeline to argue for cause and effect. Look at the sequence. In 1910, there's a secret meeting on Jekyll Island to draft the Federal Reserve Plan. Then, in April 1912, boom, the Titanic sinks, conveniently taking the key opposition with it. And what happens just over a year later in December 1913? With those men out of the way, the Federal Reserve Act is passed. The document basically asks, does that really sound like a coincidence to you?
Then, the indictment starts listing all these red flags, things it calls signatures of sabotage. For example, J.P. Morgan, a major supporter of the Fed, cancels his trip at the very last second. The lookouts in the crow's nest, they literally had no binoculars because the key to the locker was supposedly left behind. The ship received 6 separate urgent warnings about ice, but it just kept plowing ahead at top speed. And maybe most damning of all, the ship was allegedly stocked with white celebration flares instead of the red distress flares that could have saved them. The document argues this isn't just a string of bad luck, it's a clear pattern of deliberate sabotage.
All right, so from a historical crime, we now shift gears completely. For Exhibit B, the indictment takes us into the modern world, arguing that a massive psychological crime is happening right now. And the crime scene? It's Hollywood. The argument is that the film industry isn't just for entertainment. It's a system for the elite to confess their crimes right out in the open.
The whole idea here hinges on a concept called the revelation of the method. The theory is pretty wild. By hiding the truth in plain sight as just a movie, the elites supposedly get two things done. First, they gain our subconscious consent to their actions, and second, they totally inoculate the public. Think about it. If the real story ever breaks, the average person's reaction is just, oh, that sounds like that movie I saw, and they dismiss it as fantasy.
And this is where it gets incredibly specific. The indictment uses these two films as prime examples of what it calls Level 3 Archon bloodline operations. It audits Eyes Wide Shut, claiming it's not just a thriller, but a chilling expose of the masked, occult sex rituals of the global elite, and the murderous lengths they'll go to silence anyone who talks. But then it points to Blink Twice as a direct translation of the elite honeypot model, specifically the Jeffrey Epstein operation. A billionaire, a private island, systematic abuse, and even the use of chemical agents to wipe victims' memories to ensure absolute plausible deniability. The document presents these not as stories, but as operational blueprints. So, after all that, after laying out this giant, invisible prison and the alleged methods of the wardens, the big question is, what now? What's the escape plan? I mean, how do you break out of a prison you didn't even know you were in?
And this brings us to the final, actionable part of the entire case file. The escape plan, it turns out, isn't about fighting the system out there. It's not a physical fight at all. The solution, the document claims, is a deeply personal act that it calls resonance. It's about fundamentally retuning your own consciousness.
The document concludes by giving you what it calls an operator's toolkit. So step 1 is to calibrate your hardware using meditation, but it frames it not as relaxation, but as a non-negotiable act of psychic warfare to silence that internal archonic signal. Step 2 is to reject the poison, healing your body by getting rid of processed foods and so on. And step 3, which is really interesting, is to form a coherent dyad, a loving, conscious partnership, to build what it calls an island of high-frequency energy, which it claims is way more powerful than anything one person can do alone.
And in the end, that's it. The indictment doesn't give you a final answer. It doesn't demand you believe anything. It simply presents its evidence, lays out its case, and then it ends with a question. It puts the key, the responsibility, and all the power squarely back in your hands. The case has been presented. What you do with that key is entirely up to you.